Hey guys, welcome to Sean's channel. Do you guys remember that when we were in high school, we learned some American literature in our Chinese textbooks, such as The Old Man and the Sea and I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King. So I'm just really curious about how these works are accepted in America. So here we have my friend Sabrina today, and we're going to talk about the literature education in China and in America. And I hope this video can bring you an interesting perspective of how literature works are accepted in different countries. So here's the episode and enjoy watching. Cool. Hi Sabrina, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm so glad to have you here to have this chat about American literature with me. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, so my name is Sabrina. I'm 21. I am in my final year of my undergrad. I study philosophy and music, so I think I'll bring some interesting perspective to this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing them. So I just have some questions about American literature. So what are personally, what are the literature works you read when you were at a really young age? What kind of fairy tales did you read?
I didn't read a lot of American literature when I was growing up. When I was a kid, I read, you know how they have the classics but for children, they'll abbreviate them. So I read a lot of those because I loved those. And then I had this fairy tale book of Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, and I read the Grimm fairy tales as well. But none of it was really American. Because honestly, I don't think I got introduced to American literature seriously until 10th or 11th grade, and that's because we were learning The Lost Generation, that group of writers after World War I. And it was F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway and all these other Americans who went to Paris. So it was are they even still American in that sense? Because their stuff. But I think it's a really good point because a lot of American literature, it's more recent. When I think of American literature, I think of either, African American writers or Southern writers. Because a lot of America is very diverse, a lot of immigrants. And so on one hand, while people may write in America, or they may set their book in America, it's not, unless it's those two categories where it's Southern Gothic or African American. To me, it's not distinctly American in that sense. There's also John Steinbeck and Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden as well, and this whole American dream. I think that was a really big thing in high school for our literature classes. But I hope that made sense. I feel like I'm rambling. I'm sorry.
No, because I just find the Grimm's fairy tales and Andersen's fairy tales are kind of universal thing because we read that too, the stories. But I guess for the fairy tales, we also have some Chinese ancient stories like the Monkey King, the Journey to the West, that kind of stories. But so also I'm thinking that the first American literature me personally I have read was Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, and I guess that was the first time I was amazed by how literature present the history to its readers, because we have learned about the American Civil War in our history textbooks, but I didn't really think about how people really live in that kind of time, how people rebuild everything after the war, and how people make difficult choices at that time during the war. So this book, it brought me a perspective that I didn't think I could really experience. So I think that's really amazing, and especially it was adapted to the movies, and my mom really liked these movies. Gone with the Wind, so how about this work? How's this work accepted there in its home country in America?
I feel a lot of people will talk about Gone with the Wind, but I don't really think it's something we read anymore in high school. Maybe if you're studying a college level class and it's like specific on that area. But I don't know, the thing is, it's hard because I live in the South, and so there's a lot of stuff with like people who still wear like Confederate flag paraphernalia and this stuff, and so a lot of people, they don't really want to talk about the stories in the Civil War just because they feel like they're saying it was okay, which isn't necessarily true. But I feel like you also mentioned another novel like Huckleberry Finn or like Tom Beach's Cabin, I think.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these books, or even like To Kill a Mockingbird, they're starting to get like banned.
Oh.
For like a lot of parents are protesting, they don't want their children to be reading these books because they make them uncomfortable. They don't think it's appropriate.
Oh.
Which I think is very ironic. But there's just, I don't know, it's like a lot of push and pull. I meant to ask you that actually. In America, it's very common for parents to be very involved in like their children's like schooling in terms of like high school and particularly like middle and elementary. But is that normal in China as well?
Oh, well, I think my father was very involved with my education in terms of like either literature or English, but it really depends because my mom, she's a teacher, and sometimes she's bothered by some parents that they think teachers should just teach everything to their children and the parents just do nothing in terms of the education of their children. So in my mom's opinion is that school is an important part for the children's education, but also family education is another important part. Especially if you think that even in my mom's class, like there are more than 60 or 70 people in one class, so it's really hard for her to separate attentions to each student. So she really needs the support from the parents, Yeah.
It's the same in America in a sense. It's just sort of like parents are so involved, it sort of comes to the point where sometimes they're interfering with their child being able to get their education. I feel like there are some parents who have very strong opinions or beliefs and they don't want their children to be reading certain books. Like I know there are people who don't want their children to read Harry Potter per se because it goes against their religion, and that sort of stuff. So I feel like a lot of books that I guess talk about America and its culture and its history, like you don't get to read them as much in high school just because there are a lot of parents who say they don't want their children to be reading it.
Do you think it's their right to decide so?
I think I empathize. Like I understand why they wouldn't want them to read it because it talks about this very sensitive subject and it makes them uncomfortable, but at the same time it's also, I don't know, I feel like we shouldn't avoid it for that reason either. I feel like because it's uncomfortable, we need to talk about it. And I feel like being able to do it in like an English class where you can look at it like from a book and see it from like different characters' perspectives and sort of get like a glimpse of both sides is a really good and safe way to do it. So
yeah, I think that's a very good point. Like we need to talk about something that, I think that's a very good point. Right, so except Gone with the Wind, when I went to high school, and in our Chinese textbooks, there are some also selected foreign literature, and I remember we learned Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, and also I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King. Will you feel like kind of surprised that we have this kind of work in our Chinese textbooks, or do you think it actually makes sense?
I think a little bit of both. Because I feel surprised in the sense that in America, we don't give that sort of consideration for other cultures, as sad as that sounds. But another part of me is also like really happy that other people feel like, oh, like our history and our culture is worth learning and it's like important. So
yeah,
I don't know. I feel like in America, that education, the standards for what children have to learn are constantly being rewritten, sort of to the point where a lot of children aren't really learning what happened. They're learning like an abridged version where they don't talk about the extent of things. And so I feel like in America, that's why we have a lot of, I don't know if ignorant is the right word, but people who don't really know better in this sense because they never just learned about it in school. So,
right. When I went to college, then because I majored in Chinese literature, but we also learned, many important America or European writers and works, and even literary movements. I got the chances to read more America writers like Fitzgerald and Nabokov, T.S. Eliot, and even more and more contemporary works like Twilight, American Psycho. What about these works? Like, do you read them, or what's kind of like the contemporary works you read? Yeah.
I think in terms of like American Psycho and like Twilight, like I think people would read those for fun, but they wouldn't read them in like their English class for like an essay or something. I feel like there's a very distinct difference between like YA literature, which is what we call young adult literature. It's for like teenagers and it's like fantasy or whatever and romance based, rather than like, I guess, I don't want to say real literature because that has its own implications, but traditional novels in that sense that people value. So I think on one hand, the more contemporary stuff is saved for, I guess, college, because it's hard to argue that newer stuff is necessarily better or like worthy of being considered a classic. And I think it's a lot safer for like high school students to like just read older, more books that have already been appreciated that you don't have to justify.
But what about like, do people like Twilight there?
It's like you love it or you hate it. Like a lot of people were into it when it first came out, and then you look back on it now and you're just kind of like cringy. I saw on like Facebook there's a post about it, and they're like, I can't believe I was into this, and it had a quote from the book, and it said, Bella laughed, ha 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 ha, and it was just it was cringy. But I think it was more of like, it definitely had like a really big cultural importance though, I think, on like my generation.
Right. It's because I did a module called Contemporary Gothic when I was in the UK, and we discussed about Twilight. Yeah, that was fun. And many of my classmates could not believe that we are going to read Twilight in our class. And yeah, but actually it's kind of fun because they say they thought they didn't really like the book, but when they read it again, they find like, okay, it's like forgivable that we used to into this book. So here's another question: is that like the literature works we just mentioned, will they have some different opinions from different states? Like some states appreciate them, some states don't.
I don't know about specific states as much as maybe region. Like
region.
Like I mentioned the Harry Potter one, and how a lot of very like conservative religious people don't like it because they think it encourages witchcraft and like Satanism. And I think that would be more common in like maybe the South or like the Midwest.
Do you think like there is like any typical feature for American literature, or do you think there's not such thing?
I think I don't know if I'd be able to name one, but I feel like with a lot of American literature that I've read, it's been very like satirical, almost just contemplative on like the actions, what the government is doing, that sort of stuff. And so in one sense, I feel like there's this acknowledgement of oppression, but then there's also another aspect where it's like hopeful in the sense that we can do something about it. Because I feel like the American dream was a really big deal, especially during the 20th century, and I feel like that you can see that in a lot of literature still today.
So I think kind of like America is a rich country in terms of the literature works and also writers and also some literary movements. So I'm always curious about the literature education there. Like what do the pupils, do the children, do the high school students learn literature? Do you have any like literature classes in high school or primary school?
I think all the way from kindergarten to high school, we're required to take English, and that's what we call it. And the focus is more on writing during elementary school to through middle school. It's only like once you get into your final year of middle school that you really start to read literature per se. I remember 8th grade, which is the final year, was the first time I read Romeo and Juliet, and it was for my English class. But when we get into high school, things become a little more different just because it may be based on your teacher as well and what they want you to read. But there's a lot more emphasis on literature as we think of it in terms of Western culture. Before, like in middle school, we're still reading a lot of like young adult literature, and it's about summer reading and just making sure that you're not losing what you've learned in school. Honestly, for me, I didn't really start getting into reading literature like serious, sort of, that we think of now, until high school. And even then, it wasn't like we were all in class analyzing this one book. We had a list to choose from, and then we had to do like our own project based off it. I remember in my final year of high school, the professor just told us, okay, pick a book and I'll give you all individual quizzes based off the book to see what you've learned and that sort of stuff. But it also depends on like what sort of level you're taking the class in. So in the United States, we have CP, which stands for college prep, and then we have honors, and then we have AP, which is the college equivalent of a class. And so depending on what level you're in, that will also affect the work that you do.
Right, so it's not like you have a textbook and you are going to follow the structure of the textbooks, but it's more like the tutor will give you some options and you can choose what you're interested in, and then you just pick one and you just do some presentation or things like that.
Yes, and I think towards the end of high school and the beginning of high school, we did have a textbook, but we never like read the entire textbook from beginning to end. It was more like we were assigned this textbook by the state, and the teacher used it for this one part, and then after that, it was what the teacher really wanted us to learn. So.
Right. So what about like the assessments, like the exams?
Usually for English, it's not as test heavy per se, because I think once you get to high school, they want to know that you're learning more than just, oh, I can read this book and talk about the plot, about what happens. It's more like, what were the themes? Why do you think they portrayed this character this way instead of like another manner, and that sort of stuff.
We didn't really have some AC oriented assessments. Yeah, so that's kind of fun to know.
I think that's interesting because I don't know what it's like in China, but is it often like, and during this year of school, you're going to read this, this, and this, and it doesn't matter like what school you went to, like everybody read that. Is that how it's like?
Yes, mostly, yeah. So we have several textbooks. The school can choose which textbook to use, but here in my region, we use one textbook. So the final exam will be like the whole city will use the same exam paper. So for different schools, we will take the same exam, and the result will be compared among different schools, different districts of the city. So it's basically the same.
I remember in my second year of high school, we had a project, and she said, pick a historical fiction book, and you'll write an essay, and then you'll have like a creative aspect to it. And so that was like an art portion. And so I read a book, it was about World War II or something, and so I had to write an essay on that. But then I also had to creatively show a scene from that book. And so I think, particularly with American education, there's a lot of emphasis on being creative and going beyond just being able to answer like the Scantron or the test in that sense. And I think part of that is that they want to appeal to students from different backgrounds.
Because you think that people are from different cultural backgrounds in your class. What's that like?
Like there are definitely more perspectives, and it's not just people sort of saying the same thing back and forth to each other in different ways. It's more like actual like conversation or discussion, and we talk about someone else's perspective and why they think this.
Yeah. And
then someone else like would give a reason to support that, and someone else would say, well, there's this other example that kind of goes against that, and I think this. I think in one sense it's a lot more fun, but it's also just culturally nourishing, if that makes sense. I feel that, at least in America, when we study literature, it really is just Western, like European literature. Yeah. It's not really, and some occasions we'll study like Southern Gothic with like Connery or Flanner, or I don't know if you call Tennessee Williams Southern Gothic, but you know, maybe not stereotypical people you think about with literature from an American perspective, but it's not really as common per se. It's not like we're learning about literature in the sense of its culture, which kind of sucks, because I feel like there's a lot of really good literature out there, and I don't know, and part of it might just be the way it's taught as well, because they're trying to reach out to so many different people and give them so many options, but it also kind of feels like it's lacking that like foundation.
Because you didn't really major in literature when you were in college. You are in college, so when did you like stop receiving literature classes? Because like here, though you go to college, like everyone, regardless of your major or department, you will have to take Chinese classes, like everyone, but you know, many of them don't really listen to what the tutor says during the class. They just play their phones, but but it's mandatory, it's compulsory. Do you have this sort of thing that you still have English classes to take in college?
Yes, so we call them general requirements, and you have to take like 2 math, 2 science, 2 English, 2 foreign language, like that sort of stuff. But a lot of the time people will take those classes in high school so they cannot have to take them in college.
So here comes to another question, is that do you, like you personally, do you have any chances to read any foreign literature work, like Asian literature or Chinese literature?
For I think my own pleasure, I say yes, just because I'm interested in it. And also, I took a Chinese Chinese thought class last semester, and that was a lot of fun. And we read a lot of like texts about like Taoism and then Confucianism. So that was really cool, and like just exposure-wise, getting into that sort of stuff. So I think it would definitely benefit people to take classes from different cultures.
How do you find like it's different? Like the Chinese philosophy is different from the traditional Western ones, like the Greek or you know, European philosophy?
I think in some ways I like it more, because I feel like with a lot of European philosophy, it's very it's like very argumentative, or it's very logical, and like you have this claim and then you have these sub-arguments to support it. But with a lot of the Chinese philosophies we were reading, it was just sort of like, here's this like phrase, or here's this sentence, and then what does it mean? And there's no right answer. You have to come up with it on your own, and I really like that. So
yeah, true. I think so, because my dissertation was like a little bit about Chinese philosophy and Deleuze and Guattari. So I kind of find that it seems like for Western philosophy, there's like a center for everything, and like everything has a center, like the tree starts from a seed. But if you look to Chinese or Eastern philosophy, it seems like it does not necessarily have to start from a center, and like it kind of like embrace the emptiness of the world, and it just accept that the world is like nameless, like it's not traceable.
I like the emphasis on chaos and how it wasn't a bad
Yes.
thing as well. Because I felt like in a lot of European philosophy, it's very like order is important and things have to be right. But I felt like Chinese philosophy was more understanding that there's really no such thing as right, or just because someone else says something is right doesn't mean it's right.
That's true. What do you think is the outcome for literature education in America?
I think this is generic and just, I guess I'm thinking more in terms of like the humanities in general.
Yeah, I was thinking about the outcome for literature education here, and I think it's that except one purpose is, of course, it is a way for you to learn this language better, to learn how to use this language as a social tool to help you to communicate and express your feelings better, like in a more efficient way. And on the other hand, like another purpose I think is that it shows you the possibilities of language, like what can language do. It can be written into lyrics, it can be chanted in a poetry, and it can become a speech that can influence thousands and thousands of people. So it is in these ways I feel like we learn how to appreciate the language that we have, whether it's like in English or whether it's in Chinese. And so as to be proud of this culture and to have a sense of belonging to that we are with something.
There are definitely opportunities. I don't know if it's like this in China, but they have specialized schools. So some schools, like my school was specialized for art, and another school can be specialized for like math or science and that sort of stuff as well.
We don't really. I think it's more like because we have a general examination before you go to the university, and we call it 高考. It's like the higher educational entrance examination. So everyone wants to go to the university, you have to pass this examination. And according to your final score, you get to choose which university you can go. For example, the best universities we have, like Peking and Tsinghua University, you need to rank really high. You are making this competition against the whole province, thousands and thousands of people. So it's really, really competitive. And so that's how it works here.
Oh, isn't it? So is the examination the only thing that they look at for determining where you go to university?
In China,
that's very different from here.
Very different.
Yeah, because in America we have to apply. We have to pay to apply, and then we have to send in our transcript of our grades, and then we have to take standardized testing as well. And then there's also recommendations.
Yeah, we don't have that. We don't have recommendations. So it's really just based on the exam result. They kind of like overlook the quality of like your other activities, like, and because that kind of exam is so important for us, because everyone wants to go to, generally everyone wants to go to the university, but that exam is the only way you get there. So it feels like you are preparing for this exam for 12 years since you are in primary school. So it's really a lot of pressure. And so our high school life was like you wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning and you left school at 10 o'clock in the evening. It's like every day you just study.
I think in America we really value having discussions in class, and so being able to talk about what we learn instead of just the teacher lecturing and being like, okay, this is what you need to know. That's wow. I can't imagine being in a class with 60 other people in high school. That's insane.
Yeah. Did you live on campus?
Mm-hmm. We were required to live on campus.
But do you have like any regulation that, rules you have to follow when you live in this kind of accommodation?
The freshman year, we weren't allowed to have boys spend the night except for like special weekends. But I also go to a women's college, so it's only women's. So it's not really normal in that sense. Generally, it's very much as long as you're not troubling anybody and like you're being respectful of everyone else, like you can do what you want, I think is how it is at normal universities. My school is a little more conservative because it's a women's college, so there's a lot more, and we're also all women, so there's a lot more, you have to clean up after yourself in the bathroom, you can't leave hair everywhere. So it's like a very big adjustment for everybody to leave home for the first time for some people, and then be forced to share like their own personal space with somebody else.
Yeah,
I think I had a hard time adjusting to living with someone else.
And tell me about like the exchange program you took.
So my school has, I guess, an agreement with the University of Glasgow, but I decided that I wanted to study abroad in a French-speaking country, so that way I can work on my French as well. So I chose Brussels and in Belgium, and then I found a program online.
Oh, what do you think like it's a difference, like the major difference you spotted when you were in Brussels and compared to the American universities, and also how about like the people there?
I think in terms of education in Europe, I find that it's way more concentrated. So if you study philosophy at like the university I went to, you would only take philosophy related classes. You wouldn't take like the 2 English, the 2 math. Like everything you learn would be philosophy. And so in that sense, I think it's really nice because then you can just focus on that one discipline. Yeah. But I was talking with someone else and she was telling me how she was a law student. And that program usually takes like 7 years or something. And then she decided in her 3rd year she didn't want to do it anymore. So she had to start all over again once she switched to like the med program. Yeah. And so I think here in America, like if you want to change your major, it's okay. Like it's not really that big of a deal because you have to take those general requirements and that gives you time to think about what you want to do. While in Europe, it's sort of like you have to have already decided before you go to university.
Right.
So that was something I noticed with education. Another thing that I noticed is that we had absolutely no homework except for my French class. I think that was different. Like all my other classes, the only thing they graded was the final exam. And so your entire grade for the course was just that one exam. And I remember one of them just having 4 questions on it. And it's just kind of like, you're supposed to measure your entire semester's worth of learning based on these 4 questions that you don't even know when you go in there. So in that sense, it was very different. In terms of like people and culture, I found that the people over there were a lot welcoming. I feel like in America, we have a tendency to like make cliques and just hang out for groups and then not hang out for anybody else. But it might just be because I was studying abroad and I was hanging out with a lot of people who were also on exchange as well. A lot of people were open to like meeting new people and trying new things, which was really fun as well. I feel like in America, it's very easy to be competitive and to think, oh, I have to be number one and I have to be better than everyone else. But I feel like when I was over there, everyone else was like too worried about like, okay, I need to learn this thing or I need to do better instead of like comparing what they're doing with everyone else.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the same thing when I was in the UK because I really cared about like if my classmates understood me. I mean, in a way that, this person comes from another country and she speaks English and of course not as well as us. I'm not a native speaker and I really cared about that. But there's one time like my friend, she told me that, do you think your classmates can understand your language? I think, yeah, but I just worry that there's some accent. And she's saying like, then that's fine. Like it's just a tool for you to communicate. And if they can't understand you, that should not be a problem. And you should just focus more on your own purpose there. So I feel like kind of people are not, very competitive in a way compared to other people, but they are competitive compared to themselves. Does that make sense? Like they focus on themselves and I think
I like that as well.
Yeah.
Because I was talking with someone else who did the exchange with me from a different school, and he said how for like his major, if there was a test in a class that they were all in, the professor would name the person with the highest score and then name the person with the lowest score for the test. And it's just like, I feel like that's really common in America to just like sort of, I guess, pit students against each other rather than like encouraging them to work together and to learn from each other. And I thought that was like setting up Brussels. I saw that a lot where the students from the same cohort, they would work together and they would help each other out instead of looking at each other as competition. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, true. Another thing I thought it like similar is that here when I was in, say, high school, like the teacher will really expect you to say something in the class, even though we have like 70 people in one class, but she really expected you to stand up and say something. And I didn't really think that's a problem. But when I went to the university in the UK, my tutor, they were not really, they didn't want to force you to speak if you don't want to speak in the class. I think it's more like they respect that some people just don't want to speak in front of, people, in front of the public. But they have their own thoughts, like they can express it in their essays or, any assignments. They don't have to stand up and say it out loud. So I found that's really different. Like they really pay attention to individuals' differences. Here, like the education I received is more like, when sometimes I say, hey, I cannot do this. And the teacher will say, everybody can do this. Why you cannot do this? Just like everybody. I didn't think this logic is wrong or, there's a problem in this logic. But until like I studied there, I found like, hey, I'm just different from other people. So it should be like there should be no standard for, apply to everyone. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I felt like I learned a lot from that exchange, just like about myself and just like what I enjoyed and how I actually do enjoy learning and studying philosophy and going to school. And I liked how like that whole experience put it into perspective from instead of okay, you have to worry about like your GPA and you have to make sure it doesn't drop and all this other stuff. I was just like, okay, are you proficient enough in this to pass this exam? And it just took off like all this stress because it was like, okay, I either pass or I don't, is essentially how it works for a lot of the courses there. I don't know, is it like that in the UK?
Well, I'm not sure about the undergraduate, but for postgraduate, we do have scores, and you have like 50 is pass, and then 60 is merit, and 70, if you are above 70, you are distinction. Yeah, so you have that, but I kind of feel people don't really care about that. It's also a problem of pass or not pass. Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like it's really nice in comparison to like American programs, but I also feel like the standard of education is higher in Europe compared to America. So.
Right. Is there like any like a huge difference between like South and North?
Yes, there's a very big difference. So like there's this thing called Southern hospitality. From how I understand it, it's a lot of be nice. People will be nice to you in your face, but then they'll talk bad about you behind your back, sort of, is how I've interpreted or how I've seen it. But I feel like people in the North, they're very like, if they don't like you, they don't like you. They're not going to pretend. But I also know a lot of people, I don't know if prejudice is the right word, but they're biased against people in the South because we're not as educated and all this other stuff because we don't have the resources, honestly, in a lot of rural areas, like areas in the countryside or in the mountains. And so I feel like a lot of people in the North make fun of people in the South for like their accent, the way they talk, the way they dress. And so in that sense, I find myself offended. But in other senses, I don't want to say I understand, but I feel like people in the North, they're very like, they live in cities and they're living this fast-paced life and all this other stuff. But I feel like people in the South are a lot more like family-oriented and very relaxed in comparison. It's a very different culture, I would say. People in the South compared to people in the North. I think people in the South are regarded as more friendly, for sure, though. Like we'll smile at each other from across the street, even if we don't know each other. While people in the north, that'd be weird. Because like, I don't know, it was kind of like that in like when I was in Europe as well.
Yeah.
It's like if you saw someone, you couldn't just play hi. Like, I don't know, because on one hand, it's nice. Because like when you see someone, you'll look at them and like you smile and you'll say hey, and then when they ask how are you, they want to know. They're just in America. That's the American thing. When people say how are you, they don't care. They just say it because they have to say it. But like I found that in Europe, people they actually care, and so when they ask you, they want to know, and that was very nice.
I know, because the same when I was like there's like a housekeeper cleaning our kitchen every Monday, I guess, and when I met her and she asks you how are you, I say I'm just a little bit busy with the dissertation things, and she will show a very concerned look. Just you need to get out to some to get some fresh air, sweetheart. They just call you sweetheart, and they call you my love, like goodbye my love, just I'll see you next Monday. I really love that lady.
I don't know, I think I've grown to like it here, which would have surprised younger me, but I feel like the South has its own culture and it's very different, but I don't think it's bad at all. There are a lot of people in the South that are very nice who aren't Confederates. So I think that's just one of those things where you tend to see the bad more than the good on like social media and on the news as well. So
So great to have you here today, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you for talking to me.